In today's episode, we've got mandatory wedding gifts, white lies, and a classic proverb about bwaa. It's time for your Jewish week. Hey everyone, welcome to Your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovi. As always, this podcast was produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Today is Sunday, the 24th of Tammuz, and before we get started today, I'd like to let all of you know that, thank God, my wife and I were blessed with a baby boy just over a week ago. So if today's podcast sounds like it was written at 3 a.m. under the influence of coffee and sleep deprivation, that's because it absolutely was. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. If you're going to be spending Shabbat in the company of a new baby, with a fondness for loud noises and oozing all kinds of interesting fluids, you'll find Shabbat Candle Lighting Time coming in this week about 3 hours earlier than you would like it to. As always, halachic times for your location can be found quickly and easily at Chabad.org/times. Starting us off, as always, with the weekly Torah portion, this week we've got a double parsha. We'll be reading both Matos and Maasei. We start off on Sunday with some laws of oaths before getting into narrative mode. Hashem commands the Jews to take revenge on the Midianites, whose honeypot scheme a couple parshas ago led to tens of thousands of Jews worshiping idols and dying by a divine plague. Pinchas, who was the guy who stopped the plague, follows through on his earlier actions by joining with a force of 12,000 men to fight Midian directly. They completely wipe out the adult population, including the chief instigator and professional curse slinger Bilam, and going into Monday, we'll describe how the Jews divide the spoils of war and purify themselves after the battle. A lot of the loot the Jews brought home was cooking utensils. And so, as a part of the post-war roundup, Hashem has to teach the Jews how to make them kosher. The idea is that cooking utensils absorb tiny traces of the forbidden food that was cooked in them. So if you want to use them for kosher food, you've got to purge those traces. We call that koshering. Next, the Jews take a head count and figure out that not a single Jewish fighter was killed in the whole war. Not a bad outcome. Out of gratitude to Hashem, they donate all the Midianites' gold jewelry to the Mishkan. Tuesday, the tribes of Reuven and Gad approach Moshe with an interesting request. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen the Jews smash through a couple of the kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan River and conquer their land. Now, this land isn't technically part of the promised land of Canaan, but it is prime real estate if you've got lots of animals and you need plenty of sweet grass to feed them. So these two tribes approach Moshe and ask if these conquered lands outside of Canaan could be theirs. And immediately, Moshe is not super impressed. He points out that ditching the rest of the Jews to settle outside Canaan is some pretty lousy optics. It looks an awful lot like the spies from 5 weeks ago who tried to scare the Jews away from Canaan and ended up getting nearly everybody sentenced to death in the desert. But after the two tribes assure Moshe that they will enter Canaan with the rest of the nation and take part in the conquest, he relents and gives the land to them in Wednesday's portion. Also in Wednesday's portion, we'll transition over to our second parsha, Maasei, which opens with a list of the 42 stops the Jewish people made in their 40-year journey through the desert, which finally deposited them right outside the Holy Land on the east bank of the Jordan River. On Thursday, Hashem will outline the borders of the future land of Israel and formally charge the Jews with the task of eradicating the current corrupt inhabitants of Canaan and settling the land in their place. The land will then be split up into big chunks and allocated by lottery to each tribe. And on Friday, we'll see Hashem appoint one official from every tribe to help split their chunk between all the people in the tribe. Now, the only tribe that doesn't get a chunk is the tribe of Levi, because the Levites aren't supposed to be farmers. Their role is to serve in the Holy Temple and be sustained by tithes from all other Jews. But they are granted 48 cities to live in, because even Levites need to live somewhere, plus they get some area around the cities to put their cows and sheep and pet goats and whatnot. Can't be keeping those in the city. Finally, on Shabbat, we're commanded to designate 6 cities, actually Levite cities, as cities of refuge, basically a safe zone for someone who kills another person accidentally. Unless it was a completely unforeseeable freak accident, Jewish law allows relatives of the victim to kill the killer on sight. But if he makes it to a city of refuge, he's safe as long as he stays inside. On the subject, we'll also learn about the prohibition of accepting bribes to give a murderer a lighter sentence, and we'll revisit the Daughters of Tzlafchad storyline from last week. If you recall, the 5 daughters of Tzlafchad successfully petitioned Moshe to be allowed to inherit their father's portion of the Holy Land, being that he had no sons. This week, some of the other members of the tribe come to Moshe and say, hey, if Tzlafchad's daughters get his land, that means when they die, it'll go to their husbands. Well, if they marry someone from another tribe, their children, who will also be part of that other tribe, it goes by the father, are going to eventually inherit that same land. So effectively, that land is being gypped from us, from our tribe, and handed over to some other tribe. And as the parsha closes, Hashem instructs the daughters of Tzlafchad to find husbands from their own tribes in order to forestall this problem, and indeed they do. Mazel tov. And with that, we conclude the 4th book of the Torah, the book of Bamidbar. Next week, we'll be on to the 5th and final book of Devarim. Parshas Matos contains 112 verses with a bunch of fun memory keys. First up, we've got the name Buki, which sounds like a Yakuza mob boss, but isn't. We've got the name Aval, which sounds like a stunt motorcyclist, but also isn't. And we've got the word Yekev, which sounds like a Romanian curse word, but is in fact the Hebrew word for wine vat. And Parshas Maasei contains 132 verses, with the memory key being the phrase Machla Chola. Machla was one of the daughters of Tzlafchad, and Machla Chola can either mean Machla is sick, or more probably Machla dances. I'm going to choose to believe it's the second one. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into this week's keys. In the weekly Tanya, we opened this week by dialing in on Tshuva Ilah, the higher level of Tshuva, which the Alter Rebbe touched upon at the end of last week. If you recall last week's episode, we compared our soul's bond with Hashem to a rope made of many small strands. When a person does a sin, he snips one of those little strands. Tshuva Ilah, simply put, is amping up our connection to Hashem so profoundly that it kind of automatically repairs those disrupted channels. This can be through increased Torah study, doing more mitzvos, or by meditating and generating strong feelings of love for Hashem. Each of these channels rectifies a certain strand. So, for instance, if a person does a sin that's associated with the mind, increased Torah study floods the mind with holiness and repairs the bond. In fact, it doesn't only repair it. If it's done properly, it actually makes the connection stronger than it was before. That's kind of one of the distinctive features of Teshuvah Ilah. Going into Tuesday and Wednesday, the Alter Rebbe will lay out how Teshuvah Ilah can be attained at various points throughout the day, and explain that the more basic level of Teshuvah Tata, must first be attained as a prerequisite before you can reach this higher stage. And that's an interesting point, because the more basic tshuva is associated with regret, mournfulness, pleading for mercy, while the higher kind of tshuva ilah, is characterized by joy and confidence. So we'll explore the interplay of those two ideas on Thursday. As part of that explanation, Friday will touch upon a very human consideration that I think a lot of us have had at one point or another. Just how far can we push this whole tshuva thing? I mean, if you do something wrong to someone else, let's say you break his trust, you let him down, there's only a certain amount of times you'll be able to say sorry before he stops taking it from you, right? So how can we, who all live very long lives, thank God, full of mistakes because we're human, honestly expect Hashem to keep on forgiving and forgiving and forgiving over and over? So on Friday, the Alter Rebbe is going to set the record straight and kind of draw a strong contrast between the human concept of forgiveness and the divine concept of forgiveness. It's a fascinating chunk of Tanya that continues into Shabbat, and it really fleshes out where the confidence and joy of Teshuvah Ilah comes from. It's one of those high concept pivots in Tanya. They have an almost TED Talk-like quality to them, to use a terrible analogy. If you learn it properly, it can really change how you think about Hashem. I mean, putting aside all the unknowable, cosmic, transcendent, divine stuff, the stuff we can't possibly understand, which is most of it, Hashem is simply just a really, really nice guy. And he likes us quite a bit. And I think that's just a really transformative thought, and I don't use that word lightly. I mean, I do use that word lightly all the time in general, but I'm not using it lightly here, so there you go. Anyway, moving on to Daily Rambam, the 3-chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos tracks are going to be wrapping up the laws of Matnos Kehuna, the various gifts that must be given to the priests on Sunday and Monday, and starting Monday we'll be heading into the laws of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, when all farming work must be put on pause and the land of Israel must be allowed to rest. This happens every 7 years, kind of like the weekly day of rest, Shabbat, which happens every 7 days, and there's lots of laws associated with it. We'll be studying all of that straight through to Thursday, when we'll transition over to the year of Yovel, which takes place every 50 years at the end of 7 Shemitah year cycles. We'll stick with the laws of Yovel until Friday, when we'll begin the 8th book of Mishnah Torah, which deals with the Holy Temple and its various vessels. This is especially appropriate now during the 3 weeks, when the Rebbe encourages us to study these very laws, as we'll mention when we get to the daily overview. In the 1-chapter track, we're continuing with the laws of acquiring gifts. We're going to delineate some of the criteria for a gift transfer to actually take effect. Among other things, it has to be given publicly and explicitly, often in writing. In cases where we aren't sure if something was given or not, we look for clues in the behavior or wording that the giver used. That's going to lead us to some interesting cases on Tuesday, when you really see the Torah analyze human nature to adjudicate the law. Wednesday, we've got an interesting kind of gift called shushvinos. It's almost like a wedding registry. The friends of the groom would give him money for the wedding, and if someone gave you shushvinos, it was a very strong social expectation for you to return the favor when he got married. So much so that it's almost a quasi-legal requirement that you can't just opt out of. And Thursday, to the end of the week, we'll discuss the concept of shchiv meirah, someone who's on death's door. Because of his unique situation, when he gives a verbal instruction to give someone a gift, it has a lot more weight than it otherwise would. We'll discuss that in detail. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're ready to join one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. First off, as we mentioned last week, we are currently in the 3-week period between the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, when we observe several mourning restrictions in memory of the tragic events of the past. That includes not cutting our hair, not listening to music, and not holding weddings. We also traditionally learn the portions of Torah that pertain to the Holy Temple as a way to contribute to its spiritual rebuilding and hasten the coming of Mashiach, when we will have the 3rd Holy Temple physically, may it be speedily in our days. In Jewish history, Monday the 25th of Tammuz marks the yahrzeit of Rabbi Aaron Barachia of Modena, a 17th century Italian scholar who authored many works of Kabbalah. In particular, he's known for his book Ma'avar Yabok, the Yabok Crossing, named after the crossing that our forefather Yaakov traversed in the dead of night, only to be interrupted by an antagonistic angel halfway through. In the same vein, Ma'avar Yabok also deals with sickness, death, and the transition to the next world. In addition, Rabbi Aaron Barachia helped establish many of the ritual prayers and practices that are relevant when preparing a body for burial. I myself had the opportunity to take part in this mitzvah a couple times. In both cases, it was a Jew who passed away far from any established burial societies, and I kind of had to take it on out of necessity. So I spent the night before taking a crash course on the whole process, the different verses that we say, asking Hashem to help the deceased along on his transition of the Yabok crossing, as it were. At certain points, you talk directly to the deceased person in front of you. It was all this very surreal and otherworldly experience, and much of that was laid out systematically by Rabbi Aaron Barachia of Modena. Moving on to Tuesday, the 26th of Tammuz is a day of celebration in memory of the public victory against the Frankists in 1759. The Frankists were a culty kinda sect thingy, founded by Jacob Frank, who looked at Judaism and said, you know what this religion needs? A little pseudo-Kabbalistic psychobabble, some half-digested Christianity, and some weird secret dance parties. Let's go for it. So he went for it, and the result was about as bizarre and off-putting as you can imagine. Actually, no, it was worse. It was way, way worse. It was one of the most messed up things I've ever read about. Now, despite the twisted nature of the Frankist sect, or I don't know, maybe because of it, it did have a certain kind of mystique and a bit of a following. But in 1759, a Christian bishop organized a formal debate between the Frankists and a number of prominent rabbis, including the great Baal Shem Tov himself. It lasted 4 days, and on the final day, the 26th of Tammuz, the Baal Shem Tov and his colleagues emerged as the clear winners. It was pretty nearly a death blow for the Frankists, and a day of rejoicing was proclaimed to thank Hashem for the victory. Moving on to Wednesday, the 27th of Tammuz, we've got the yahrzeit of a true icon, Rabbi Yom Tov Erlich in 1990. Yom Tov Erlich was an insanely talented composer of dozens and dozens of Yiddish songs, which have earned rightful acclaim as true classics of Jewish music. In his songs, he captured moments from Jewish history, both in the distant past, his present day, and in a number of songs, also the future, with the coming of Mashiach, inspiring the broken Jewish survivors of World War II with optimism for the future redemption. His lyrics are sophisticated, well-constructed, and perfectly balanced to the meter of the song. That's one of the things I love about them. They just exude this old-world elegance and class and a kind of warm nostalgia and genuine heart that makes them really one of a kind. He was a true artist, and I definitely recommend checking out his work, even if you don't know Yiddish. It just has that feel. I'll also attach a link in the show notes to the recollections of Rabbi Hillel Zaltzman, who knew Yom Tov Erlich personally. It's quite an interesting read. Thursday, the 29th of Tammuz, we've got the passing of Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried, a celebrated rabbi and author of the world-renowned Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. Basically, Rabbi Gansfried took a look at the Code of Jewish Law, also known as Shulchan Aruch, which is massive on its own, even before you get to later commentaries, and he boiled it down to a much shorter, practical guide for day-to-day Jewish life for the layman. He called this abridged version Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, the summarized Shulchan Aruch, and it remains wildly popular. On many occasions, the Rebbe encouraged people to study Kitzer Shulchan Aruch regularly and familiarize themselves with it. And nowadays, it's easier than ever. Chabad.org has the entire Kitzer Shulchan Aruch online with a full English translation. There's really no excuse. Maybe take this podcast as a nudge to get cracking and really acquaint yourself with this excellent resource for living Jewishly. Friday, the 29th of Tammuz, is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, better known as Rashi, in 1105. Rashi is truly a household name. His commentary on the Torah is the authoritative guide to understanding the simple meaning of the text, and he is recognized unanimously as the number one companion for any student setting out to learn the 5 books of Moses. The same goes for the Talmud. Rashi's commentary is available for about 3/4 of the tractates in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's written in the same style as his other commentary. It's illuminating, it's step by step. It's like having a personal teacher. Occasionally, it's almost conversational in tone. In his own time, Rashi was the leader of several different Jewish communities, including the town where he was born. And before I go further, I want to play a little game with you guys, all right? It's called Figure Out How Nonsensical French Phonetics Work. Ready? I'm going to spell a word, and you have to guess how French people pronounce it. Okay, here we go. What does Troyes spell? If you guessed Troyes, you should be correct, but you aren't, because it's French, and it's pronounced toi. I tried telling the French to stop messing with how words are pronounced, but they never listen. I guess bwaa will be bwaa. Anyway, I'll attach a link to a brief biography of Rashi in the show notes if you'd like to learn more about this very influential figure in Jewish history and scholarship. Shabbat, the first of Av, is going to be Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the new Jewish month. As always, we mark the day with additional prayers, and uniquely, because this is a Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, those extra prayers are kind of woven into the additional Shabbat prayers that we say every week. In Jewish history, the first of Av marks the yahrzeit of Aaron, the brother of Moshe, in 2487, the year before the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. We already covered the passing of Aaron in the Torah portion section a couple weeks ago, so I just want to touch upon one particular aspect of this remarkable man's legacy. Aaron was known as someone who brought peace and reconciliation between people who were fighting. As our sages put it, he loved peace and pursued peace. Now, what does pursuing peace mean? It means that Aaron didn't just wait around for both sides of the argument to come around and be friends again. He was proactive. When he saw a conflict between two friends or between a man and his wife, he took it as his personal mission to bring them back together using whatever tools he had at his disposal. One famous example of this involved a bit of creative license. If two friends got into an argument, Aaron would go up to one of them and say, "Hey, Jeffrey," but only if his name was Jeffrey. "Hey, Jeffrey, your friend is a bit too embarrassed to come over himself, but he really regrets what he did to you and he'd like to make up. He asked me to come and tell you." Which of course wasn't technically true. Then he'd turn around and tell the same exact story to Jeffrey. The way I think of it, Aaron was kind of like one of those martial artists who knows how to redirect their opponent's force. He used his insight into human nature to coax people back together again. Even if it took a little ego stroking, a little exaggeration, he made them realize that their argument wasn't really all that important and that, at heart, they both truly respected and valued one another. I've heard a story about our Rebbe, though I'm not clear on the details, but I believe the general gist is that someone who took a hardline stance on various issues met with the Rebbe in a private audience. I haven't had a chance to go look up the exact conversation, but it seems like the Rebbe asked him at one point why he expressed himself so harshly to his fellow Jews. Well, the guy replied, perhaps with a bit of righteous pride, "I'm a kanoi, I'm a zealot." Kind of like Pinchas in last week's Torah portion, a kanoi is someone who acts decisively and directly in pursuit of the greater good, and I guess that's how this guy saw himself. So the Rebbe responded, "Where's your kanos, where's your zealotry in Avas Yisrael, in loving another Jew?" In other words, it's all very nice to be zealous when you're defending your own idea of what Hashem wants from the other guy, but what about loving Hashem's own children? Where's your zealotry when it comes to that? Where's your single-minded sense of purpose, just like Aaron had, that led him to bend the rules and twist the facts for the greater good of promoting brotherly love and reconciliation? This Shabbat, as we remember the special characteristics that made Aaron so unique, perhaps we can adopt some of his attitude ourselves. Let's try to view our fellow Jews favorably, to think twice before we condemn, and create a more united, loving Jewish people in the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi Dovi Paltiel. Theme music by Levi Gloshak.